It made us face apartheid face on. I always wanted to come back to Sophiatown. In our culture, where your umbilical cord falls, that's the place you call home. I came back in 1997 and bought this house to say I'm back home.
As the Russian invasion of Ukraine continues, BBC News has in-depth coverage.
It's very clear the war in this area is extremely active.
This is the site of a Russian missile attack on the eastern edge of Kharkiv.
The Ukrainians have already pushed the Russians out of this city once. The fear is they're going to have to do it again.
See the headlines as they happen with breaking news alerts in the app and get the full story with bbc.com/news. Follow the story for all the latest with BBC News.
Hello, I'm Maryam. Moshiri. You're watching The Context on BBC News. European gas prices soar again after Russia further cuts its supply to Germany. But as the gas crisis worsens, Ukraine prepares to export its grain as Turkey opens a headquarters to oversee operations. The Federal Reserve hikes US interest rates for the fourth time this year as it tries to tackle inflation. Also on the rise, the cost of McDonald's cheeseburger as the price is bumped up for the first time in 14 years. Tonight with The Context, Ian Bremer, president of the Eurasia Group, a political risk consultancy, and the former Labour MP and Cabinet Minister, Caroline Flint. Welcome to the programme. Well, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has had a seismic effect on world energy prices, and the situation has just become even more dire. There are warnings of energy rationing across Europe this winter after the Russian energy company Gazprom further cut the flow of gas to Germany. Well, European gas prices have soared close to the record high they reached when Russia invaded. President Zelensky accused President Putin of withholding Russian gas to try to provoke political and economic turmoil in Europe.
It is clear to everyone that this is Russia's deliberate price terror against Europe. Using Gazprom, Moscow is doing everything to make this winter the toughest for European countries. It is necessary to respond to terror, respond with sanctions.
Olga Karkova, a Deputy Director at the Atlantic Council Global Energy Centre and an expert on European energy security. Olga, really, it's unsurprising, isn't it, that we are where we are now with this?
Absolutely. We have been talking about this for several months now. It is historic, though. We are talking about gas prices being over 10 times fold of what we've seen in the past. But this is why these kinds of meetings and preparations at the EU level, the ministers all across from the EU met yesterday and were able to come together and agree on another historic decision, a unity among all of them in terms of curtailing by 15% in their gas consumption. Now, there were several exceptions based on where the countries were in their energy usage, what they've done before, and how much they're relying on Russian gas. But yes, this is unfortunately not a surprising situation, and we will continue to anticipate further gain from Putin.
How hard do you think Russia can make life for Europe?
They are pushing the limit. So right now, Nord Stream 1 supplies are down to 20% of what we've seen in the past. Europe really, truly needs a Zelensky moment. So Russia anticipated that Ukraine would fall within a couple of days of attacking Ukraine. And Zelensky and the people of Ukraine stood up and fought back in ways that shocked the world. And no one anticipated this level of resistance. So Europe needs to do the same right now on the energy level in order to minimize the damages and the suffering and for households and the damages to its economy. Europe needs to continue its solidarity built on meetings like we had yesterday in Brussels, continue this kind of coordination both at the electricity, on the electricity side and on the natural gas side, and work through this together because nations cannot handle this crisis alone.
In the meantime, looking at the immediate needs of Europe, can prices be brought down now, and if so, how?
So emergency efficiency measures. So we're talking anything on the household, individual level, empowering people with information on what they can do at home, what's feasible, what's going to be the least amount of uncomfortable for the energy consumers. And of course, there's going to be coordinated levels of efficiencies also on the natural gas operators, on electricity operators, and figuring out how at each of these levels, these measures could be taking place. Now, of course, there's certain things that will need to be done in midterm and long term, but I think right now we're really looking at what ways to minimize, to destruct demand as soon as possible.
Olga, thank you. Let's bring in our panel. Caroline, you first of all. I mean, there really is time pressure now, isn't there, on Europe to diversify away from this reliance on Russian energy?
Absolutely, but as Olga said, this isn't something new. I can remember as Minister for Europe being at a Council of European Ministers back in 2008, and as we sat around the table, phones were going off as member countries got the call that Russia had shut down the supply of gas through Ukraine. So Bulgarian ministers and others were rushing back home to deal with a crisis then. I mean, I think it is something now that Germany has had to really face up to. They historically have set their face against nuclear power, partly because they see it connected with nuclear weapons. They have moved to renewables, but to be honest, they've relied on energy sourced through coal, and they've relied on energy sourced through Russian gas. So as Olga said, I mean, will European Union keep its nerve? Yes, I understand about energy efficiency. That is one of the more medium long-term ways to save energy, both in domestic and industrial use and commercial use. But the truth is countries like ours, the UK, much of our housing stock is not as energy efficient as other countries in the European Union. And regardless of all of that, we're looking at potentially a price cut going up to beyond £3,500 in October and maybe another spike in January. So families, particularly those vulnerable poor, are going to need a lot more help as we enter the winter months.
Ian, let me bring you in here, because what's interesting about this is the geopolitical order, really, in terms of Europe, has been turned on its head, hasn't it? With northern European countries no longer as they were during the economic crisis, when we're talking about that, telling southern European countries what to do. It's kind of the reversal now.
Yes, but we shouldn't be surprised. And let's keep in mind the level of sanctions that we have seen from NATO, from the EU, from the United States against the G20 economy, Russia, is unprecedented. We've gone through 7 rounds of sanctions now, and the Europeans have hung completely together. You've frozen Russian assets, you've pulled out multinational corporations, and you're not buying all sorts of Russian goods. And the only exception is energy. And the reason energy is an exception is because the Europeans still need it. But as soon as they don't need it anymore, they want to cut it off. They're diversifying. So, I mean, if you're Russia and you know that the Europeans have every intention of getting away from Russian energy as soon as they can, within a year, within 2 years, you think you're going to just wait for the Europeans to do it on their timeline? Or are you going to shut it off when you have maximum leverage? And that is before this winter. Because if the Russians do that, they think that there's a greater chance you'll see more of a peace movement in Europe and more opposition from Europeans that are suffering economically through a cold winter to tell their government, we don't like this. I do believe the Europeans are going to hold together, but it's hard to get really angry at the Russians for using the one piece of leverage that they have left when they know it's going to go away soon. You're angry at Russia for invading Ukraine, but there's no surprise on this energy move.
Olga, I saw you nodding at one point.
No, I mean, I think I completely agree. Seeing how Russia is behaving right now, the next 9 months is going to be critical. Getting through this winter is going to be critical. Filling up storage, or at least right now, I mean, it's a matter of even maintaining storage level with the energy crisis and the prices and the low levels, historically low levels that are going through the pipelines right now. So, but Russia is also hurting itself, and it's tarnishing its reputation as a supplier forever through these actions.
And does that mean, Ian, that Russia will then end up at some point in the not too distant future not supplying the energy it does now?
I think as long as they're supplying under cost to the Indians, to the Chinese, to others, they'll continue to buy it. But I certainly agree that the Russians are going to be decoupled forcibly from the advanced industrial economies, and that's effectively permanent. As long as you have a Putin or Putin-type regime, that's not going to change. This winter is what's critical. The Europeans, if the Russians cut off all the gas, that we're talking about a 2 to 3% contraction of GDP. That's going to be tough, but it's nowhere near as tough as what Russia's going through. And let's not even talk about the Ukrainian economy that's contracting by almost half. Next year, it gets easier. 2024, it gets easier still. Russian leverage after this winter only goes down.
So, Caroline, in effect, what you were saying earlier about getting through the winter is key, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And although the UK isn't as clearly as reliant on Russian gas as many of the other European countries, the truth is that electricity prices are also pegged to gas. And that's why we're seeing these enormous spikes here in the UK as well. So, yeah, I mean, I think Ian's absolutely right. And Olga, I think the alliance has to hold firm. We need to, I don't think there's any going back in terms of reconciling any reliance back with Russia whilst Putin or someone of his ilk is still there. So the future has to be very different. But in the meantime, there's an immediate crisis looming, certainly here in the UK, with people unable to afford their bills.
OK, Caroline, thank you. And Olga, thank you very much for joining us on The Context. Now, while the problems with gas and energy supply get worse, another major knock-on issue from Russia's invasion of Ukraine was taken a positive step to being resolved today. A coordination centre for Ukrainian grain exports has opened in Turkey. It's all part of the UN-brokered deal to get supplies moving after the war with Russia cut them off. Well, the halt in grain deliveries has seen price rises around the world, as it's thought around 20 million tonnes of grain are stuck in silos around Ukraine. Grain mainly many countries rely on. Well, the deal, which was agreed last weekend, was almost immediately thrown into jeopardy after Russia fired cruise missiles onto the port of Odessa, Ukraine's largest, hours after the signing ceremony. Well, Ian and Caroline, let me bring you back in here. And Ian, let me ask you, first of all, this really boils down, doesn't it, this deal that Turkey has helped broker. It boils down to these various countries just trusting each other. Well, how much trust and faith should one have in Russia?
There's no trust. And of course, the fact that the Russians decided that they were going to strike Odessa literally hours afterwards. And to be fair, the technical agreement only says that the Russians won't strike the ships and the port facilities that are directly involved in unloading grain. And they can claim that that's not what they hit. But, you know, it's very clear that they're not trying to facilitate life for the Ukrainians. The war goes on. They're continuing to engage in war crimes every day against Ukrainian civilians. So this is not a matter of trust. But of course, you've got hundreds of millions of people that are suffering because these food prices are higher. And the work that the Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, as well as the Turkish President Erdogan, have done to facilitate this relationship between two countries that are active belligerents against each other, frankly, is one of the only pieces of good news we've seen since February 24th.
Caroline?
Yeah, I mean, look, any effort to broker some sort of deal here, some sort of way through, and, you know, if not the whole picture of what's happening as been outlined about the conflict goes on whilst these discussions are happening. But, you know, it just shows actually in these conflicts, there has to be talking on a number of different fronts. Whether or not the Russians are going to play ball with this, I don't know. I wouldn't necessarily hold my breath. I think they want to use as much leverage as they can to be in the pole position on this. But again, I think this is another example, along with energy, where whether it's wheat or energy or whether it's water around the world, if you control assets that are globally sold and you can control how they are provided for and reach people in different countries around the world, then you can completely distort the way in which the prices are set, but also the way people access these goods. And I think it's a really good, interesting example of how assets of countries are part of the source of conflict. Probably they always have been, but even more so, I think, going forward.
And Ian, I think Sergei Lavrov was in Egypt a few days ago, the Russian foreign minister, and they talked about Russian grain supplies. And to be honest with you, Africa is one of the continents where so many countries rely on those grain supplies from Ukraine.
Yeah, the Russians are getting something out of this deal. They sell a lot of food and fertilizer as well. And as part of the deal, the European Union did take sanctions off of some of the Russian banks that were involved in the transactions that facilitate that trade specifically. There weren't sanctions directly on the food export, but the Russians had a reasonable point that it was nonetheless being contained and constrained by the sanctions. So the Russians get some more money out of this. They get some food out of Russia. The Ukrainians get to bring some food out as well. So, look, I wouldn't hold Caroline's breath either on this deal, but I do accept that there's a likelihood we're going to see some of this food get out. Prices should come down a bit.
OK, Ian and Caroline, thank you once again to you both. Well, the US Central Bank has announced another unusually large interest rate hike as it battles to rein in soaring prices in the world's largest economy. The Federal Reserve said it would increase the key rate by 0.75 percentage points, targeting a range of between 2.25% and 2.5%. The bank has been raising borrowing costs since March to try to cool the economy and to ease price inflation. Here's the chair of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell.
The economy and the country have been through a lot over the past 2.5 years and have proved resilient. It is essential that we bring inflation down to our goal if we are to have a sustained period of strong. From the standpoint of our congressional mandate to promote maximum employment and price stability, the current picture is plain to see. The labor market is extremely tight and inflation is much too high.
Well, let's speak to our North America correspondent, Gary O'Donoghue, who is in Washington for us. And Gary, explain to viewers, why is it the Federal Reserve feels that it has to raise rates again by such a large amount?
Well, it's really because inflation is at this 40-year high, more than 9% as of an annualized figure from last month. And we haven't seen those sorts of figures since the 1980s. So this is a real problem because it undermines the amount of money people have in their pockets. It means they can't afford to buy everyday things. It puts a huge amount of pressure on ordinary Americans and ordinary businesses around America. So the aim of getting inflation under control, as the chairman put it, is the bedrock of a proper economy. Stable prices, the bedrock of a sound economy, and it's really running away from them at the moment. So interest rates make it more expensive to borrow. That tends to cool demand, and demand is the driver of inflation, of course. So they're really trying to slow the economy down without driving it into recession. And of course, that is a hugely complex judgment they have to make. And that is why the chairman was also asked repeatedly today about whether or not he thought America was in recession or heading for one.
Gary, thank you very much indeed. Well, let's bring our panel back. It's interesting, isn't it, Ian? There's such a fine line between what the bank is trying to do and the road towards recession.
Yeah, certainly. And again, President Biden fully understands that his unpopularity, which is at the worst levels right now of his presidency, though so far in the mid to high 30s, lower than Trump's was at this point in his presidency even, is largely driven by inflation, largely driven by concerns about the economy. So this is front and center for him. You've got monetary and fiscal tools. The fiscal tools are very challenging given how divided the razor-thin majority that they have in the Senate. That's why you're seeing the bank move as quickly as it can to raise rates.
It's interesting, isn't it, Ian? Because, you know, you mentioned that the political risk of high inflation, it really does have an impact, doesn't it, on the way that people view their everyday lives and the way they want to vote.
It is, and a lot of this is psychology. You know that wages have been increasing for workers over the course of the pandemic. Unemployment is at incredibly low levels. Labor has a lot more leverage. But when your wages increase, especially when they haven't for a long time, you feel like, well, that's because I deserve it. That's because, of course, I'm working well and I should have that money. And then when prices go up, you feel like, well, that's something that's been taken away from me. So the psychology of inflation is consistently almost always a much greater negative than other sorts of economic impacts. And there's no question there's a direct transmission mechanism from that to voting in the midterms.
Caroline, let's bring it back to the UK now, because, of course, there is a Conservative Party leadership contest on at the moment. And we have Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss, two very different viewpoints on how to bring down inflation in the UK. Rishi Sunak, of course, the Finance Minister, the Chancellor, the former Chancellor, saying that cutting taxes is not the way forward. So it's interesting, isn't it, how the battle to control inflation here has also been politicised?
Oh yeah, and I mean we've got the two now lead candidates to be the next prime minister, basically slugging it out and basically demonising their own economic record, it would seem, in different ways, and that's a complete gift for Labour here. But yeah, I mean, look, we've had the Bank of England charged with keeping inflation down to 2%. We've enjoyed low inflation rates for the most part of the last 20 years. And of course, it's now, reaching around 10%. And interestingly, in terms of the politics of all this, and if I think about those red wall seats that the Conservatives won in 2019, actually the inflation rates in the north of England are higher, slightly higher, but higher than in London and the south. And that's because there's more car dependency in the north of England. And there's also our homes in the north of England are not as well insulated as those in the south. And it's really interesting how now with the energy prices and the cost of fuel, that comes into impact and into play here as well. So if you live in Blackpool, Burnley, or other parts of the north, you're paying something like 11% in terms of inflation. Down in London and places like Cambridge, it's down at 9%, still very high. But the Tories are trying to find a way through this. But I have to say, neither of them really I've got an exact answer, because it is really difficult. Because if you do things to try and prevent inflation rising, then some people find that not acceptable. But on the other side of things, is you put up wages, as Ian said, that can then have a knock-on effect on inflation, so you lose out. It is very difficult. It is very difficult at the moment making the right call.
Caroline, thank you very much. Let's move on and talk about something that is very, very much connected to what we've just been saying. Companies are at the moment facing increased costs for things like fuel, wages and ingredients, with prices rising at their fastest rate for 40 years. Those costs are now very much being passed on to the consumer. In fact, yesterday, the drinks giant Coca-Cola told Bloomberg its global prices had increased by an average of around 5%. Amazon also announced it was increasing prices for its customers, with the cost of its Prime subscription service rising by £1 a month from September. Well, Kit Kat maker Nestlé, Marmite maker Unilever and the bakery chain Greggs, they're all amongst those who've already increased prices this year. The food group Kraft Heinz has also lifted its prices sharply, up 12% in a year. And now here's the big one, the one that everyone has been talking about. McDonald's has put up the price of its cheeseburger for the first time in more than 14 years. So I believe it was 99p. It now costs £1.19 to get a cheeseburger in the UK. I mean, cheeseburgers aside, Caroline, this is really, really worrying for so many people who are struggling.
Yeah, I mean, McDonald's, not just their burgers. I think they had about 6 items at 99p, just below £1. And that's been a marketing campaign ever since probably McDonald's arrived here in the UK. But, when you look at some of the products you just mentioned, they're not necessarily the most healthy products, but they're the sort of products that people enjoy and buy a lot of. And it's spreading across the whole, shopping trolley that families are going out to shop every single day at the moment. And it's worrying for people. And of course, for those who are the poorest in our communities, I would say that inflation is a harder thing for them as well. And that's why I think that, beyond what has already been provided by the government, whoever emerges as the new Prime Minister is going to have to think really seriously about what more they can do to help people. They could do an uplift in our welfare payments and benefits to help people, even for a temporary period, a bit like the furlough during the pandemic. They could look at reducing VAT on energy, and there's other things they could do as well. But it is very worrying for people's shopping baskets at the moment, and it's probably going to get worse.
Ian, I know I'm going back to McDonald's again, but it's quite incredible. 14 years they've managed to keep the price of a cheeseburger below £1. 14 years, and now they've had to put it up. It tells you something, doesn't it?
Well, it tells you that it's not about your individual government. This inflation is happening all over the world, whether you've got a left-wing government or a right-wing government. And the reason is very simple. you had an extraordinary contraction of the global economy because of the pandemic. You locked everything down. Your supply chains were completely disrupted as a consequence, and massive amounts of money were pumped into the economies, not just for wealthy people, not just for businesses, but just for people to get through it. And then you opened up the global economy, and suddenly you had a massive increase and spike in growth, but with those supply chains still in great challenge. And that's even before the Russian invasion of Ukraine and all the difficulties in terms of the food and the fuel. That's even before zero COVID starts locking down. Today, 18% of China GDP is under lockdown. Wuhan is completely locked down. 4 cases, right? You put all of that together. I don't care who's running your country. You're going to deal with unprecedented levels of inflation. It's a real challenge. Policymakers have to take it seriously. They have to respond. But the blame here is much more structural than it is, your local neighborhood leader.
So where's the answer then? If it's, much more structural in terms of blame, is it much more structural in terms of the answer?
Well, yes, it's going to take time. I think that in 6 and 12 months' time, literally some of this is going to it will deflate. Why? Because you're going to have more normalized supply and demand. You're going to have goods more in place. You're going to have supply chain in China. The world's factory is not going to be locked down the way it is right now. Literally, a lot of these dislocations are once in a generation or more. Those are not persistent shocks. They're unusual shocks. They need unusual policy responses in the near term, but they're not permanent. This is not a new normal of double-digit inflation for some of us in some of these goods. That's not what we're going to see for the next 5 years.
OK, well, Ian and Caroline, thank you very much indeed. And before we go to our break, I want to let you know that you can, of course, get up to date on all the latest stories that you've been watching here on the BBC on our website. As always, it's bbc.com/news. Also, if you're interested in any topics that we've been discussing on The Context or would like to give me your opinion or even your own take on The Context, do tweet me. I'm at BBC Maryam. But don't go anywhere for now. Come back in a few minutes' time. Plenty more to come.
Can someone working alone solve all the world's biggest challenges? Isn't collaboration the way we'll bring clean water to the world's megacities and produce enough food for a growing population? At SABIC, we believe the chemistry between people is the chemistry that matters. SABIC.
The power of invention will protect us from climate catastrophe, say the optimists. Smart technologies will reduce the clouds of carbon dioxide emissions from the industries that make the materials surrounding us. At least that's the hope.
I'm now going to introduce you to an invention that is so bold, so brilliant and so extraordinary that you will think it is a trick.
Hear that sound? That's the sound of ink coming out of the page.
But can carbon-cutting inventions be developed in time?
Are you sure this is safe, yeah?
It's safe.
Safe, okay. So here we go.
And can art help to draw attention to the challenges ahead?
We've been using car panels and various scrap bits of metal that have become this beautiful bit of work, which is just fantastic.
I'm Roger Harrabin, the BBC's environment analyst. For 30 years now, I've been raising the issue of climate change. Now, on the verge of leaving the BBC, I'm trying something different. I've invited sculptors to help tell my story for me. Haven't I?
Prices are rising across the globe, sending the cost of living soaring. So why is this happening, and what does it mean for you?
The war in Ukraine seems a long way away from this beach in South Shields, but the soaring price of potatoes, fish, oil, the energy to cook them is in part due to that conflict. It's causing a cost of living and a cost of doing business emergency.
But it's not just about food. Tourism, which is a lifeline to the Egyptian economy, is likely to be hit hard too. Around 40% of tourists who visit Egyptian sea resorts come from Russia and Ukraine.
Before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Zimbabwe was already battling a double-digit inflation, and these price increases are likely to worsen the economic outlook.
The surge in energy prices and inflation, a global phenomenon affecting the entire world.
Business on the BBC. Make the connection.
I'm very interested in the connection between people, and I love the fact that people see that in the book, that it's about our shared humanity.
Every time I think about what he saw and what he went through, it makes me feel so sad. You just want to make the painting for him. Sorry.
Fluid, dynamic, androgynous, he's now at the forefront of a new generation of progressive choreographers who are drawing new audiences to contemporary dance.
It is just extraordinary. Whatever their method, they only had one chance to get that right.
Inspiring arts and culture on BBC World News.
Hello, I'm Maryam. Moshiri. You're watching The Context on BBC News. Back in Washington and back in the headlines for Donald Trump. After a hardline speech last night, there are now fresh reports. Federal prosecutors are investigating his role in the attempt to overturn the 2020 presidential election. But lawmakers grill gun manufacturers on Capitol Hill, whose weapons were used in some of the recent mass shootings, including the Uvalde school massacre, where 19 children were murdered. And less than 24 hours from the Commonwealth Games opening ceremony, we'll bring you up to speed on the host city, Birmingham. Tonight with The Context, Ian Bremer, president of the Eurasia Group, a political risk consultancy, and the former Labour MP and Cabinet Minister, Caroline Flint. Well, the US Justice Department is examining Donald Trump's actions over attempts to overturn the 2020 presidential election results. That's according to reports in the US media. Now, they say federal prosecutors have asked witnesses directly about the behaviour of the former US president. So far, they haven't opened a criminal investigation into Mr. Trump himself. No former US president has ever been indicted for criminal conduct. Well, Trump was back in Washington yesterday and dropped yet more hints he may run again in 2024.
I always say I ran the first time and I won. Then I ran a second time and I did much better. We got millions and millions more votes. And you know what? That's going to be a story for a long time, what a disgrace it was. But we may just have to do it again. We have to straighten out our country.
Well, the Attorney General, Merrick Garland, in an interview with NBC News, called the investigation into the January 6 Capitol Hill riots the most wide-ranging investigation in its history.
Look, we pursue justice without fear or favor. We intend to hold everyone, anyone who was criminally responsible for the events surrounding January 6, for any attempt to interfere with the lawful transfer of power from one administration to another, accountable. That's what we do. We don't pay any attention to other issues with respect to that.
Our North America correspondent Anthony Zerka. Anthony, where do you think this could potentially lead?
From the reports, it sounds like the Justice Department is specifically looking into these attempts by people around Donald Trump to promote alternate or fraudulent electors who would claim that Donald Trump, not Joe Biden, won certain key swing states and report that to Congress, and then Congress would be able to decide the election themselves. Now, the question is whether this was illegal or not. It all happened out in the open, but that doesn't mean that the Justice Department couldn't decide that this was an attempt to subvert the election and bring charges against someone in Donald Trump's circle if they have proof of that, or Donald Trump himself if they get people to testify that Donald Trump knew about this plan. It's a tricky situation because the Justice Department then has to decide, do they think there's a criminal case? Do they think they can win a criminal case? And injecting this obviously highly politically charged prosecution into the middle of the midterm elections would be a major step, the likes of which we haven't seen in any kind of a criminal investigation so far.
Let's bring in our panel now. Ian, how likely do you think a criminal investigation is going to be into the former president?
I think the Attorney General said it correctly, that no man is above the law. And since impeachment is broken as a political process in the United States, and you saw that all along party lines with Trump's unprecedented 2 impeachments, no convictions, that if he feels like there's a convictable case, he should pursue it. But of course, the possibility that that ends up strengthening Trump politically is very real. And, you're going through an election right now in the UK, and sadly, my country is even more politically dysfunctional than yours. And that is a high bar.
It's not a competition, Ian, but...
It shouldn't be, but it seems to be these days. And of course, people are very deeply worried that we have a former president who not only continues to push a big lie about his own election and undermine the legitimacy of the national election process, but he's very likely to announce that he's going to be a candidate in very short order. And while he's weaker than he was 6 months ago, he still is the odds-on favorite to get that nomination and to contest an election for president that he will say is a failure and is rigged against him if he loses. That's a very serious problem as we all look ahead to 2024.
Why is he weaker than he was 6 months ago, do you think?
Well, of course, he doesn't have the same level of attention in the headlines that he used to. He's been banned from Twitter, banned from Facebook. That's a challenge. He's a little older. He's a little slower. I mean, Biden's not as popular as he was either. But also, he's lost some key support. That Rupert Street Journal and the New York Post both had editorials out from the editorial board saying that Trump is no longer fit to run for president. That's a shocking change for the most important individual media owner in the country that had been very much supportive of Trump. And we see that on Fox News as well, not in the evening shows like Hannity and Tucker Carlson, but certainly during the daytime coverage when they've been much more supportive of people like Governor DeSantis in Florida. So I think it's very clear that at the very least, you would see a competitive primary against Trump once he announces he's going to run, as is now widely presumed to be coming in the coming months.
Anthony, I mean, it is interesting, isn't it, how the right-wing media has kind of, well, the Murdoch media, at least in the US, turned against Donald Trump. Do you think that he's been weakened within the Republican Party by the January 6th committee?
About what the outcome of the January 6th hearings would be and whether it would change anyone's opinion. And while I don't think that it's moved the needle too much to people on the right agreeing that these hearings were a good thing, I think it has reminded Republican conservative voters of the chaos that surrounded Donald Trump's presidency, and that has damaged him. I think it's no coincidence that since those hearings took place, we've heard more and more talk about Donald Trump wanting to launch a presidential campaign sooner, because I think he realizes he needs to try to get a platform back, to wrest back the narrative and be able to get the message out himself. And as Ian noted, Rupert Murdoch and Fox News and his empire shifted away. I was at a Donald Trump rally in Arizona on Friday night, and while Donald Trump was speaking on stage, Fox News wasn't covering that rally. Fox News had Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, on as a host on Laura Ingram's show, evening show. So I think that tells you a little bit about the direction that conservative media wants to head, and that they feel like they need to start putting their thumb down a little bit on Donald Trump's incipient presidential campaign because they think that there are other people out there who would be better candidates.
Very interesting. Anthony, stay with us because we're going to talk to you in a minute about guns. Specifically, gun manufacturers pocketed over $1 billion from the sales of AR-15 style guns over the past 10 years. That was one of the revelations at a US House of Representatives Oversight Committee today that was looking into the role of the firearms industry in America's gun violence crisis. Well, some of the gun makers represented today were Smith & Wesson, which makes firearms like the one used in the Highland Park, Illinois shooting, where 7 people died, and Daniel Defense, which manufactured the type of gun used in the Uvalde, Texas school shooting, where 19 students and 2 teachers were killed. Well, here's the chair of the committee, the Democrat Carolyn Maloney.
It seems to me that if a company really cared that its products were being used to kill scores of Americans, it would stop selling them. But of course, the gun industry won't do that because they're making lots and lots of money from these weapons. As shown in the chart behind me, over the last 10 years, Daniel Defense collected more than $500 million in revenue selling AR-15 style assault weapons, the weapon of choice in too many mass shootings. Ruger also made over $500 million on these weapons, and Smith & Wesson made more than $600 million. That is the very definition of putting profits over people.
Well, in response, the CEOs of the 2 gun companies who appeared at the committee tried to deflect blame away from gun manufacturers.
I believe our nation's response needs to focus not on the type of gun, but on the type of persons who are likely to commit mass shootings.
We come to work every day with the goal of building rugged, reliable firearms that responsible citizens are proud to own and lawfully use. Our motto, Arms Makers for Responsible Citizens, is a testament to our company culture and philosophy dating back nearly 75 years.
And Anthony in our panel once again. Anthony, what exactly is the Oversight Committee want to get out of this?
Well, I think this is, to some extent, political theater. They want to ban assault weapons. They want to pass that in the House of Representatives, but it's pretty clear that any kind of a ban is not going to pass the Senate. So this is positioning for political advantage. But there's also the reality that political theater sometimes work. If you remember back to the 1990s when the tobacco executives got brought to Congress and they held up their hand and said under oath that nicotine was not addictive, they became investigated for lying to Congress several years later. And that became a turning point in the idea that nicotine and tobacco executives should be regulated as a drug. So there is a potential, I think, they see to turn public opinion more against gun manufacturers with this sort of thing.
Ian, is this theatre, do you think?
It's performative. You look at what people care about. It's number one, inflation. Then you've got immigration. Then you've got education issues. The country is very divided on gun issues. It doesn't move the needle much for most of the people that are actually running. Certainly after the Uvalde killings, there was, and you saw all those hundreds of police officers that were sitting outside. These are the good people with guns, and what were they doing? They certainly weren't protecting the school kids. They were waiting while a massacre was occurring inside. That is not the narrative that the NRA has been talking about that says gun rights and everybody has to have guns. But you know, there isn't, the average American still doesn't feel like this is something that moves them enough to change their vote. And therefore, the average political figure wants to say that they care about the issue, but isn't prepared to show any political coverage to move on it. Look, the United States is the only advanced industrial economy in the world that has anywhere remotely like this level of gun violence. And, you know, you've got all sorts of mental disorders, you have them all over the world. You've got sort of all sorts of other challenges. Those are consistent. The thing that America also has that's really unusual is an extraordinary preponderance of guns. It's like Yemen and the United States is number 2 in guns per capita. And until American political leaders are prepared to do something about that, you're going to continue to see this violence.
Caroline, what do you make of it when you look at this from the UK's perspective?
Well, it's interesting, you know, 20 years ago when we had the shooting in Dunblane, you know, our government took action to look at how we could even further restrict, which was very limited access to guns in this country. And I think, as Ian says, I think when I hear the American gun person saying it's not the gun, it's the person, well, lots of countries around the world have to deal with people who are, you know, have all sorts of things, have put things into their heads to commit acts of violence, but they haven't got a gun that can shoot a classroom of children in less than a minute and kill them all, potentially. And that's what I find really difficult in all this to understand. What I know of American gun culture and American ideas about it, I don't think there's any chance that there's going to be a total ban on weapons for use in the way they are in America. What I find really hard to understand is why there isn't more backing for regulations and restrictions on who should be able to buy guns, what measures are taken to check these people out, but also just the sort of guns that are available, which, you know, there's the sort of guns you think about in a theatre of war, not to be kept in someone's home in an ordinary suburb in America.
That's the thing, isn't it, Ian, that people in the UK at least don't understand, is these high-powered assault weapons. What use are they to people?
Yeah, I mean, it's not like there's a huge military industrial complex that's making so much money out of these guns, right? I mean, the size of the industry is comparatively small when you compare it to, you know, finance and big pharma and defense. So you'd think it would be easier to break through, but the problem is that there just isn't a strong enough voice on the other side. Look, as much as we talk about gun violence, the overwhelming majority of gun violence in the United States is poor communities, and it's black on black. And those are people that don't have much of a say in politics. They don't move the needle very much. And as long as that's the case, and as long as the average person that does have a real constituent voice in American politics doesn't feel threatened, then I just don't think you're going to see a lot of outrage here.
OK, Ian, thank you. And Anthony Zerka, thank you to you. Now, the Commonwealth Games get underway in Birmingham on Thursday, with thousands of fans arriving in the hope of seeing some gold medal action. The event will thrust Birmingham into the global spotlight, but the Midlands city is in fact already very well known by people around the world, thanks in large part to the success of a TV show called Peaky Blinders. You may have heard of it. It follows the violent lives of Birmingham's 20th century gangsters. Well, this is one of the show's main filming locations. It's called the Black Country Living Museum. And last week, the Queen's Baton passed through the museum. Today, it arrived at the centre of Birmingham after a 90,000-mile journey. And the final bearer was the comedian Sir Lenny Henry.
These things have meaning, you know. It's not just carrying a baton. It's, for a lot of people, it's, you know, our parents came here in the 50s and we walked cold streets and we stand on their shoulders. So this is a kind of tribute to all of those people who travelled anywhere to have a better life, and to watch people compete and have a lot of fun, and to yell at a big bull in the stadium in Birmingham. We can't wait.
Well, we can talk to Andrew Lovett, the CEO of the Black Country Living Museum, who joins us live from the Jewellery Quarter in Birmingham. Thanks for joining us, Andrew. How excited is the city of Birmingham about this?
Well, I would say it's very, very exciting. So I'm just, you know, half a mile from the city centre, and as you say, the baton just arrived tonight. And I think, as with the Olympic torch, the baton kind of, I don't know, it seems to release a lot of pent-up energy with the games starting tomorrow night.
Tell us more about the history of Birmingham. What are the kind of, you know, interesting facts about the city that people watching this may not know?
I think one of the most interesting things about Birmingham is that it's the youngest city in Europe in terms of the age of population. So get this, 40% of the population is under 25. I think that's quite remarkable. And I think its history of manufacturing is massively important, as is the history of the Black Country. And of course, it was known as the workshop of the world. And I think that there's a kind of melding of heritage and very modern contemporary life, which gives it an energy, I think, perhaps unlike anywhere else.
And what do you think the impact is going to be of these Commonwealth Games being held in the city of Birmingham?
Well, for a start, I mean, I think we're up to 1.25 million tickets have been sold. I think we're just getting above the ticket sales of the Gold Coast when it was held in Australia last time. And I think the organisers are hopeful that it's going to get more than Glasgow in 2014. So having a number, and half those tickets, by the way, for people that are coming into the city, so not from the city and the region. So having that number of people coming here is great. And I think the line I would draw from the Games is the becoming a legacy of a city of tourism and a welcoming city. That's the line I would draw to the impact of these games.
Andrew, let's talk about Peaky Blinders. I have to talk about this because the film is very much connected to your museum. What has the show done to boost your museum and also the city of Birmingham?
Well, I think it's had a big impact. I mean, it's a very strange connection, isn't it? Because, you know, if you read a contemporary police report from the time, it talks about arrested foul-mouthed young men stalking the streets in drunken groups, insulting and mugging passers-by.
Sounds like last week.
It's a strange connection, isn't it? But it's I think it's taken off because, let's face it, Stephen Knight is a great writer of the show. And it's very strong and powerful storytelling, and so it's a TV feast, isn't it? Musically and visually, and it's had a big impact. So you can grab hold of it, I suppose, is what I'm saying, quite well. And we've definitely seen an increase in visitors, particularly younger visitors.
Yes,
wanting to come on set. Really,
they have, yes, because a lot of it was filmed in the museum, wasn't it? And also, actually. Sorry.
Yeah,
go on.
We're the only location that's been used in all 6 series.
Right.
So when it started in 2013, and you know, I think back to when they approached us then, and the filming was taking place. Our visitors could watch the filming take place and watch Cillian and the cast. Things moved on a little bit as I think they realised what they'd made and what they'd got hold of, and they obviously wanted to avoid spoilers. But notwithstanding the origins of the Peaky Blinders, it's had a positive impact.
And also, it's quite big on TikTok, isn't it? I think we can see something now, a little clip of someone who has posted something on TikTok from the museum, I think, and it's really blown up on TikTok. It's all gone viral. Let's have a look.
Oh, hold on a minute. Don't scroll down. Sit down. I've got something very important to tell you. Now, I know you're angry, but there ain't no point in holding on to your anger, kid. Angry or not, life goes on. And if you ain't careful, you'll miss some of the wonderful, busting, beautiful things going on around you.
Well, good advice there. You know, I think TikTok and the fact that a lot of these clips have gone viral on TikTok shows actually how so many young people are into Peaky Blinders, are into the museum as well.
Yeah, for sure. So that was a member of our staff, John Homer, and I hope you were able to understand the Black Country accent there.
Well, it had subtitles, so... I mean, I could understand it, but I'm not sure if viewers around the world would be able to.
Well, they let's hope they will do in the future. And but yeah, I mean, we're a very visual museum. We have a lot of costume characters. So actually, the connection and the ease with transferring the stories we tell to TikTok in a visual way was an easy one, actually. And we've got a lot of staff who just drop into being able, like John there, able to tell stories in a great way.
One more question before you go. One word answer. What sport are you most looking forward to watching during these Commonwealth Games?
I think the women's cricket at Edgbaston Stadium.
Interesting choice. Andrew Lovett, it's been good to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now, it's time for the panel. No matter how many times I say, now it's time for the panel, it always makes me feel so super awkward. Let's talk about subjects that both of you have told us you'd like to talk about. Ian, you first of all, you told the producers of the programme that you would like to talk about the Vogue cover shoot of President Zelensky and his wife. Why?
Well, it's a big deal, right? I mean, on the one hand, it's incredible, it's iconic, it's gorgeously shot. And here you have the First Lady of Ukraine, Olena Zelenska, with this, sort of global Hollywood type shoot that everyone is talking about. And of course, Zelensky himself has been an absolute hero for the Western world. And I've been out there very publicly talking about how much the Russian invasion was a crime against humanity and we all need to act against it. But also we're in a very divided world, and it's one of these places where, God forbid, you have anything critical to say of anyone that everybody loves, even if it's someone you support. And I personally think it was a bad idea for the president to appear alongside his wife in Vogue. And that is, let's say that's a controversial perspective.
Caroline, do you agree with that?
Well, it's these photo shoots are interesting and about presenting themselves to the world. And I think what's interesting about the president and what he's achieved in terms of his own profile internationally is incredible. And I think it's a lovely photo for a start. but I think it's something which will endure beyond whatever happens in Ukraine, about the way he and obviously the support of his wife have put them, in the forefront of global politics in terms of what they've been going through. And good luck to the pair of them.
Interesting that you both have very different answers, and I think that social media also has been very split in terms of what it thinks about that photograph and whether it's appropriate or not. Let's move on. Caroline, I thought you want to talk about a very important women's sporting event happening right now and this weekend.
Well, I think it's transcending even women's sport, because obviously it's our national game, the beautiful game, football, or soccer as it is called in America. So glad that our American cousins have got on board with this in the last few decades in supporting it. And of course, last night, I live in South Yorkshire. I was absolutely gutted that, having spent a lot of time trying to get onto the portal to get tickets for Bramall Lane last night to see England versus Sweden, I was unfortunately not successful. But what an amazing match. And I think what's been so inspiring is not just the individual performance, but also as a team, but also I think the showcase to show to the rest of the UK and internationally how far women's football has come from something that was once seen
Absolutely
as
amazing. It's absolutely amazing. I agree. And just a couple of.
We're looking to win in the final this week.
Oh, okay. That's great. That's great. We want the support, definitely. And just to say that Germany have beaten France 2-1, which means that Germany will face England in the final. Ian, are you a soccer fan? I say soccer, but it makes me feel sick saying it. Football fan.
I'm not at all. And yet I think if you're talking about the match that I caught the outtake of, that incredible no-look kick into the goal by the woman at the end. That was just extraordinary. I mean, the level of talent and confidence that took, it is an extraordinarily beautiful game, I have to admit.
Ian and Caroline, I'm afraid we've run out of time. It's been amazing to have you both on the programme. Thank you so much for joining us on The Context, and to all of you watching at home, thank you. Bye-bye.
Hello there. It's been a quiet start to the Atlantic hurricane season. Different story, though, in the East Pacific, where we have this cloud, a tropical storm called Frank, that will become a hurricane and head out to sea. One of the big stories in North America has been the rainfall that we've seen in St. Louis, Missouri. This was Tuesday morning. There was 9 inches of rain falling in 24 hours, a record daily rainfall total for the area. Some people had to swim out of their houses to get to safety. We've still got some rain in the same sort of area really on Thursday. Rain's threatening not just Missouri but also into Tennessee, into Kentucky and perhaps even into West Virginia. And as those storms move their way further south, it's not going to be quite as hot in Oklahoma nor indeed across Arkansas. At the same time, we've still got all this moisture bringing the monsoon rains into the desert southwest and onto the Rockies as well. Further west, though, it is still dry, and we've got heat wave continuing right the way into the weekend across the Pacific Northwest. Temperatures along coastal areas reaching 90 degrees there in Seattle. Inland easily making 110 Fahrenheit. And you can see we've got the threat of some thunderstorms there in Phoenix, Arizona. Let's spin the globe and move all the way into the Middle East. Normally dry at this time of the year in the United Arab Emirates, this cloud has brought some very rare rainfall. How rare? Well, just look at a couple of locations towards the coast there. We've seen huge amounts of rain compared with the July average. And in this particular example, that's half a year's worth of rain in just a day. Now, there's still 1 or 2 thunderstorms around, maybe pushing up towards Qatar as well, but we're going to find those storms moving away and heading into southern parts of Iran. It will be cool here, it will be wet at times, but as we get more sunshine in Oman and the Emirates, temperatures will start to rise again.
In our connected world, all news is international. So, for in-depth analysis and correspondence covering both home and global events, get a deeper understanding and find out what is really going on.
BBC World News America.
The Taliban, once insurgents themselves, are now in charge, and they're on the lookout for suicide bombers as well as regular criminals.
They simply cannot let the Russians through here, so they're hanging on for dear life.
That are currently trying to rebuild a bridge that was washed away here a few days ago.
It's Shanghai's most